Hello, everyone. My name is Ned Dennison. I'm the chairperson of the International Marathon Swimming Hall of Fame. Our guest today is Dr. Marilyn Morgan Westner. Marilyn, please say hello.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be here and to talk to you, Ned.
We were introduced to Marilyn, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. She sent in a half a thought for a nomination for a woman named Pauline Jackson. And we batted back and forth trying to gather historical information because Pauline height of fame was in the 1920s and 1930s. And thankfully, Marilyn is a fabulous researcher. So we put together a nomination, which was compelling. And Marilyn joined us in Cancun, Mexico, to accept the induction on behalf of Marilyn Jackson, who was a black swimmer. She came in as an administrator because she wasn't particularly successful in winning marathons, but at that time in the United States, to be a black woman marathoner was quite unique. Travel was a challenge. And interestingly, it seemed that the sport absolutely welcomed her with open arms and treated her particularly well. There was a professional marathon swimming association, and she was included in that association. And this is probably 30 years before Major League Baseball in the United States included its first black ball player. So the sport has an interesting history. I'm going to turn over to Marilyn to talk about some of her history research into 1990s sports history, primarily in North America. And then she'll also talk about some of the popularity of open water swimming as a spectator sport. So, Marilyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, sure. And Ned, feel free to have this can be very conversational. So I love when I'm engaging with people. So interrupt me at any point if I say something that you have a question about.
Okay.
So I am a historian, and I stumbled upon marathon swimming, open water marathon swimming, because I really needed something to write my dissertation about. I had written, my focus had been on gender and sport and race. And, there's so much you can write about in the history of sport that affects both gender and race, and how those dynamics interplay. But what really caught my attention was marathon swimming. I had never, as somebody who was studying the history of sport, read a lot about the history of swimming, especially marathon swimming. You read a lot about pool swimming, and it was fascinating to me. This was when I started, full disclosure, I started my dissertation a long time ago, at the age where you could still flip through newspapers and flip through microfilm reels of newspapers. So everything wasn't digitized yet. It was starting to be, but not everything like today. And you can sort of experience that today by flipping pages of newspapers. And what really struck me is in the sports pages, there was so much about swimming. And I thought, isn't this fascinating? Why don't I know about this? And anything that I had read as a historian about women swimming, especially, said women were denigrated. It was a very sexualized sport. The only reason that the newspapers featured women swimmers was for sex appeal. And, that makes a lot of sense, right? That's what we do today. We sell magazines, we put a woman in a bikini to sell a product. So
Marilyn,
that is,
I will interrupt you because some people will get the wrong impression of sex appeal.
oh,
I think at one point it was Gertrude Ederle who went to a swimming exhibition in I think it was New Jersey, and they say, like, 5 to 15,000 people showed up, and a lot of the men showed up on the off chance they get a glimpse of her ankles. So it was a different sex appeal back then.
well, no, that's not exactly. I would counter that to say that in the U.S. at least, the newspapers were showing this was sort of the debate, right? Technically, legally, you were not supposed to appear on the beach wearing anything except something that covered you from neck to knees, right? So the suits that women wore were made of wool. They were made of wool or flannel or something that they thought the body needed to be kept warm when it was cold. But what was happening back in the early 1900s, women were drowning in record numbers. Drowning was a public health threat at the time because Women didn't want to learn to swim because it was too cumbersome. Have you ever tried to swim in something that weighed 10 pounds? I mean, it's really, really challenging. And your legs are constricted. So you're wearing tights and you're wearing shoes and you're wearing petticoats and you're wearing a corset that's squeezing you as you're doing it. So women didn't want to learn to swim. So there was a lot of drowning. So to a degree, what you're saying is right, is people wanted to glimpse something. But by the time Adderley is swimming in the 20s, the late teens, early 20s, there's a really big movement for swimsuit reform. And this is all tied to the sport. And so women are starting to wear the same suits that men wore. And this is where open water swimming is really fascinating, and it's different from the history of regular pool swimming. Because ocean waves are rough, because people went to beaches together as families, men and women were swimming together. And when swimsuit reform starts to happen and people are saying women cannot swim in all of these clothes, it's like it will kill them. So they need to wear something that frees their limbs, their arms and their legs, just like men did. So men and women are wearing a very similar, the union suit, right? So it has um most of them have lower cut arms and they're one piece or two piece, but they look like one piece. There's a modesty panel, but your legs are exposed and your arms are exposed. So that's the first thing. And then the newspapers are like, oh, this is great. Here are these athletes. This is a uniform. This is no longer any fashion. Swimsuits were fashionable, right? But this becomes open water swimming is responsible for making swimsuits change from this fashionable item to be worn on a beach, just lounging with your family, to an actual sports uniform. And that's a big difference. So it becomes okay for people to wear this short, abbreviated costume on the beach, which completely, in the US at least, affronts public decency laws. You're not actually allowed to appear on a beach wearing the swimsuit. So you'd have to wear a cloak to go into the water, then you come out. And, young people being young people start flaunting this and saying, well, look, this athlete does this. This athlete is popular. Why can't I do this? This is actually good. And it becomes a little bit tied in with women's rights to wear what they want to wear. Not as much as other things, but a little bit. That makes sense. So,
Okay.
so swimming is going on this different trajectory of other sports. The other way it does that is that in open water swimming, men and women swim together and follow the same rules. So when women are launching into other sports, and this is like the late 1800s, early 1900s, women are playing tennis by very different rules, wearing very different costumes. They're branching out into sports. Same with golf. They're doing many more sports. There's a huge revolution of women participating in sports, but they normally do it women competing against women. Open water swimming, because of the very nature of it's dependent on the weather, it's dependent on the location, it's dangerous, and there's very few people willing to subject themselves to these very grueling swims. Men and women often swam at the same time, and also the water obscures you. So they might train at the same time. And unlike other sports, open water swimming is not a direct competition, usually. In the beginning, individuals are competing against others, other people's scores. It's not as if there's a bunch of people entering the water at the same time for most of the early swims. So that got me really interested because it's a complete anomaly and nobody really pays attention to it. And at the same time, people in the US, spectators loved this as a sport. People would be lined up, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on beaches, on bridges. So cities in the US, in Chicago, in New York, and some of this still happens today in California. These events before stadiums. So we're jumping way back in time before there are ticketed sports events really at stadiums. People could go and attend these events for free. They would last all day. It was a great social gathering. They would hang out of windows and climb on streetlights just to be able to watch these races. And, it was thrilling. And actually last year, a really great book, an American wrote a book called The Watermen, and it was about like how the British, this was a very British sport, open water swimming, and how the US sort of finagled their way in the early 1900s into Olympic swimming, for a New York swimmer, Charlie Daniels. And that's a great book. And it's not exactly related to open water swimming, but same idea there. And that's what this British ascendancy really of the sport is what made other people want to do it. So you have the first Matthew Webb, as you know, does the first successful unaided swim in 1875. And that's what really set the tone, is that that unaided piece is very different. And that's another fascinating thing about the sport. It's the same rules really today that there were, you know, in 1875. And how many things can you really say that about? So it's a really interesting, wonderful sport, and that's why I got interested in it.
So, as a child, and I'm in my 60s now, I distinctly remember seeing the old movie footage of Gertrude Ederle's ticker tape parade in New York City. She
Yeah.
went to swim the English Channel. She was the fifth or sixth person to complete it. She shattered the men's record. And it was, I think, the second ever ticker tape parade in New York City or something like that. And I just have this, in my mind from the, I guess 1926 probably, if I could guess the date. Um, Lead us through some of the other big uh, big spectator venues for women's marathon.
Well, I just want to say really quickly that event, there were lots of ticker tape parades, but that was the largest to date parade in New York City. There were millions of people came from all over the country, just to when she came back, and she came back 3 weeks later. A movie star, Rudolph Valentino, had died 3 weeks before, and people thought that that was going to be the biggest parade and the biggest gathering in New York. And Ederle's topped that. That's how important this sport was and her accomplishment. People followed the English Channel swims. The English Channel was known as the Everest of sports. So in the US, there were these contests that they were pretty much local. So you have the athletic association. So like the Illinois Athletic Association, the New York Athletic Association, they're sort of these clubs for amateurs, and they host these swimming events, and they would not allow women to, most of them did not allow women to compete, or African Americans to compete. It was really an event really for white men who belonged to these athletic clubs that were usually exclusive. So Washington, D.C., when you think of the geography of the US and the cities that have either big rivers or on the coast, so there's St. Louis had a lot, Chicago, New York, Baltimore area, D.C., and then on the West Coast in California, usually outside of LA, San Diego, I think San Francisco as well. And then there were smaller pockets. There were some in Seattle. So any place there was really a river or some large body of water. So all along the Mississippi. So it was something like that. These swims would be held usually annually. In Boston Light is still a swim that exists today that goes from, you know, Boston all the way out to the lighthouse. And so people just started wherever they could have a long distance swim, they would organize them, and they were usually informal. They started off in the like 1800s as pretty informal, and then maybe somebody would offer a trophy. So you'd have these competing men, like the best men from England and the best men from Argentina and the best men from America would come to different cities and they would compete. Then you'd have smaller tiered events where local people would come, and sometimes if there was a prize offered, people would come from around the world. And this wasn't, my background is really, my focus is American history and international in the sense of just the sport. But this happened not just in the US, but all over Europe in major rivers. So like the Seine in Paris, this happened in the Thames in London, Japan, uh, the Danube, rivers around the world. So you didn't really just have to be tied to an ocean, but open water swimming was really something that attracted a lot of people as spectators, because not everyone could do this either, but people were fascinated by, just like we are today, will turn into The Amazing Race or TV shows like that that show people pushing the limits of humanity, like human exertion and what's great about open water swimming is you're not just swimming against another person. There's all of these unknowns. There's jellyfish if you're in the ocean, or there's it's not as if a river gets cleared or the ocean channel gets cleared. You still have barges and boats and all kinds of obstructions and things. So people are absolutely fascinated that, and garbage, right? I mean, the waters are dirty and there's pollution, and there are times that so it gets a lot of attention, like who's going to swim through this garbage? So people are fascinated by these, this sport of extremism, and it
It's
makes for a
probably
lot of fun.
it's probably worth mentioning that most of the urban rivers in the Western Hemisphere are much cleaner today than they were
Yes,
100 years ago. And even the
they
conversations about the Olympics in Paris and the Seine is much, much cleaner than it was 20, 30 years ago. So things have improved. I want to bring you to some very sort of famous spectator items. So in 1928, I think it was, um, marathon at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. A local boy, 17-year-old George Young, had won the very famous Catalina Marathon, became a national hero in Canada, and the National Exhibition decided to hold a marathon swim. Hundreds of swimmers, um, thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and perhaps even 100,000 spectators watching this event. Water was absolutely frigid, and I think one or two people actually completed the swim. But this became at the Canadian National Exhibition for a couple of decades. It became a major draw and a must see event. Um, and then the other one in Canada, while we're at it, is a young woman named Marilyn Bell. There was going to be a stage race across Lake Ontario, and it looked like an American was set to win it. So she objects, enters the swim as a no-hoper. Back in the day when the newspapers used to print extras,
yeah.
um, and unbelievable numbers of people showed up to see this young woman finish the swim. She became a national sports hero in Canada. There were movies, there were dolls, there was merchandise, but the number of spectators was just unbelievable as she was coming in to finish the swim.
And that was 19, I think 56, right? She did it twice, to 54 and 56. And what I think is really interesting about that is when I started, there was this the very few historians that had written anything about channel swimming and spectator sports saw this as a fad. So the 1920s, which was where I was first drawn to, was known as this era where people were obsessed with marathons, yo-yo marathons and dance marathons and baby stroller, anything you could do for over 24 hours. So some people sort of said, oh, well, this marathon swimming, that's just part of this bigger fad. But it wasn't, because people, again, masses of people weren't doing the swims. Masses of people were following the swims as spectators. And that, I'm so glad that you brought up Marilyn Bell, because that spectator interest really persisted. It dropped off in the US because other sports became commercialized. That's what I think, at least, is that you couldn't really make money from it as much. So in these days when there were extra newspaper inserts, there were also multiple editions of newspapers. So you didn't just have like an evening paper. It's sort of like Twitter now, except it, or any, excuse me, X, or Instagram, or anything that's instant, except it wasn't driven by the people. It was driven by a massive company that put out updates throughout, maybe not every minute of the day, but they had, a morning edition, a late morning edition, an afternoon edition, and a late breaking news edition. So people were getting updated about these things before radio is becoming important. And at the same time, some of the swims, the Wrigley swim in California was broadcast. One of the first broadcast events, sport events that was broadcast across the country. So there's clearly an interest in people following the sport through the 20s that persisted. And this persisted despite the Depression, the Great Depression. Um, as you know, marathon swimming has a lot of expenses. So the average person the average person isn't willing to subject themselves to cold waters and the tortures of swimming and the training. It's a really difficult sport, as I don't have to tell you. And it can be very expensive because it's not just you, there's a whole team of people that you have to involve in to be successful. So back in especially the 20s, that a woman could even attempt to do this. And the first woman, remember, to even swim the English Channel to make an attempt was 1900, and she was a wealthy woman. Well, she sort of had lost her nobility, she had lost her riches, but she still had a lot of respect, and she was able to do this. So when women or African Americans were doing this, it's attempting these marathon swims, it was primarily because they were able to fundraise, basically to raise support for themselves for this cause. So the cause had to have meaning, and that it had to be important to enough people that they would want to send money, give money for this. So for instance, jumping back a little bit again, the British had this ascendancy again on the English Channel. That was the number one in the beginning. And from the time that Matthew Webb first made the swim, the second person to cross it 35 years later is another Englishman. But so many people had tried in between that when the first Americans went to make the swim, people raised money for it. So two of the first Americans, the men who made the swim, were from Boston, which is where I live. And so I know all about this. There were funds. The mayor wanted to support them. When the first American woman tried to do the swim in 1911, she also got funds from the governor. Like, this was a really big deal to people. There was something of this national pride. I want my country to do this really grueling, challenging thing that so few people in the world can do. And I know that today, you're probably rolling your eyes like, okay, everyone does the English Channel. All the marathon swimmers that I know, that's nothing. But it was not nothing then. It just like, running a 4-minute mile. So at one point, people thought no one could ever do that. And now we know, yeah, once a record is broken, then people do it repeatedly. But at the time, this was seen as something so important. There was even until I think the 1960s, so I hear, a common common parlance was a phrase like, "Oh, it's not like you're going to swim the channel." Like that, it meant something from the 20s all the way through, like, for 40 years. Referring to an English Channel swim as an impossibility meant something in the culture. And I think that's really, it's interesting that we have forgotten about that. And I I understand when we were all in Cancun not too long ago, there was this wonderful race that was held there. 4,000 participants, right, were scheduled to race. So I totally understand that there is a big following and people that do the sport now, but the spectator aspect has really fallen away. And I think it's so interesting because it is still a really fascinating sport. And
I'd like to mention two other spectator
sure.
events, and then move on to female and Black participation. So one of them is famous swimmer Lynn Cox. In 1975, she was the first woman to swim across the Cook Strait between the North and South Islands of New Zealand. The rumor has it that it was on the radio and that the listeners were estimated at more than half the nation. Um, the other one is up to date. It's very recent. Martin van Veden has an honoree. He won the 2008 Olympic marathon swim. The Dutch have a very famous series of canals. When it does actually freeze, thousands and thousands of Dutch turn up with their skates and try to skate this course, which is quite a long course. So at 200 kilometers. So Martin swam it a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
and families would show up in the middle of the night at the side of the canal, and there might be 10 people there. There might be 1,000 people, depending on the size of the village or the city. And he raised almost $7 million for cancer research. So it's just a couple of examples of spectators. Let's move on to both the female and Black participation. We mentioned Gertrude Ederle, who's a very famous swimmer and honoree. We've also honored a woman named Ida Elowinski, who was the first woman in the second person to swim around Manhattan Island, and she broke the men's record. Back in the day when women just weren't supposed to get dirty. They weren't supposed to sweat. They weren't supposed to exert themselves, and they were, yeah, they're both real trailblazers. But talk a little bit about some of those early pioneers and the culture that they were fighting and changing.
So I think it actually goes even back to the first woman that tried to swim the channel. Oh, if you wanted the first couple of women, right? So we have to mention Annette Kellerman, the Australian, who she was champion swimmer in Australia. She came to England. She was brilliant and savvy and decided she did more to reform swimsuits. In Australia, women didn't have to wear the cumbersome suits that women wore everywhere else. They swam in their union suits. But the rumor has it that when she went to see royal audiences in England, she attracted all this attention. And so the queen wanted to meet her. And in order to meet the queen, she couldn't have bare legs, and she refused to wear one of those hideous long dresses. So she sewed tights onto her suit, and she invented this new swimsuit called the Kellerman. And I'm digressing a little bit just to say that she was a pioneer because was she realized that in order to get people to accept women participating in this sport, she had to do it in a way that was acceptable to the status quo. So she didn't fight and say, I demand that I'm going to wear bare legs and do this. She did it in a way that people, it was scandalous still, but she did it. And she was a very well respected swimmer. She was a champion swimmer. The movie Million Dollar Mermaid ended up being about her, and again, played by another swimmer who was sometimes people have this idea that for a woman to be an athlete, or they did at the time, that she had to, to be a serious athlete, you had to be a certain way. And some of the swimmers are the first to say you can be beautiful and an athlete. And if you confuse, if the public confuses the two, that's their fault. Because I know, that I am this strong athletic person. And if I want to show myself in this way, I will. And so in a way, a lot of the arguments that happened about women's rights and women's bodies in sport that we hear about today, up until the present, of what women will do and whichever side you fall on this debate, because it is a very hotly contested debate. What does a woman athlete have the right to do? Will it be degrading or demoralizing, or does that set back the cause if they appear like in a sexy ad? And it doesn't matter where your opinion on that falls. What I think is really interesting is this really started back with these early swimmers. They were the very first people to begin these debates that are still happening over 100 years later. So some of these pioneering people, they pioneered in many ways. They had to have the audacity to be willing to go against the law, really, to go in public and wear these suits and cover up, risk being put in jail. They had to be able to convince people in their communities and beyond to help them raise money to go and compete in these events. They had to defy social etiquette, not only by what they wore, but at the time, women were considered frail and the weaker sex, right? So a woman who doctors said it would damage a woman's ovaries and her uterus, and she wouldn't be able to bear children, and that was supposed to be her whole purpose in life. And so they had a lot, and because of cold water, right? So not only is it exertion, but it's this cold water, it's relentlessness. And it was actually another Boston, a young woman. She was a teenager, Rose Pittenoff, and I think she was recently inducted to the International Swimming Hall of Fame, but she was a marathon swimmer. And she was avidly watched and tracked, and they tracked her blood and they tracked her everything. And so this is back in 1911 when people first started speculating women have stronger endurance than men. So she was out swimming men before Gertrude Ederle beat men's times. This young woman was. So this idea that there's something about women have extra adipose tissue, which means we have an extra layer of fat. And there were these ideas that said, oh, women are especially suited to this sport and they can actually excel at it because they have the mental fortitude. I know I've talked to people, contemporaries, who believe that, I don't think it's a biological thing. Doesn't matter what I think. It just matters what I observe as a historian. I'm here to hear what people say and what is observed. And Yeah, it's you know as well, at least what I hear about the sport from everyone that I've talked to and interviewed and read about, it's as much a mental challenge as it is a physical. It is very, very physical. No one can deny that. But also, you're swimming in the dark. You're swimming. You can't see what you're doing. It's hard. I imagine that's what fascinates me about this is I can't even imagine what must go through people's minds when it must be so tempting to give up, and to not give up is really empowering and inspiring. And every woman that did that, so you have Annette Kellerman, you have Gertrude Ederle, you have Mill Corson. She came from Denmark. She settled in the US, and she also swam all around Manhattan and did these tests. African American women had it even harder because they're discriminated against in two ways. They're not allowed to participate in these the events that white women aren't allowed to participate in either. But they're also, in terms of pool swimming, they're not supposed to swim with either white women or men. So their time, if they were really serious swimmers, they gravitated to the open water swimming. And African American communities along coasts also sponsored their own contests. Often they coincided with Labor Day, or it used to be called what Memorial Day is today, used to be called, I forget, Decoration Day. So they often coincided with these holidays, and um, again, confined to these parts of larger celebrations in African American communities included like a 5K swim or a 10-mile swim, not engaged by a lot of people, but maybe just one or two people in the community, but it was widely followed. So when women, anyone, it seems like, who was very serious about open water swimming, distance swimming, it seems like a very friendly sport. So when the African American women swimmers wanted to do this, they met and encountered white women doing this who encouraged them, and men. And so that's another nice part about this sport is there is a very strong history of segregation in some of the races, but the swimmers themselves were also very inviting and wanted to, create sort of their own, almost a different breaking away from this sort of, I'll use the word country club, and I don't mean that in a disparaging, I don't mean that it as a, I mean that as an adjective, this country club sort of sport. Um, but this real people sport that is done in open water. And if you want to do this, we're going to help you do it. If you want to find a way to do that and you're good at it, because so few people were. That's a nice story too.
It,
And I
it, it,
probably
it
didn't answer your question,
no,
but
it's interesting because I think it's very well documented that most swimming pools were heavily segregated back in those years. And I think if we look at today, um, 20 years ago, Tiger Woods wasn't the first black golfer, but certainly was the first black superstar golfer, and completely and absolutely changed that sport. If we go back to tennis, players like Arthur Ashe fundamentally changed perceptions in that sport. And if we go to open water swimming, it happened decades before those other sports, and
yeah.
it's kind of fascinating to me. Um, and maybe it's we could talk about elitism and everything, but when you're standing by this side of this big body of water, and you're having somebody wipe porpoise grease all over your body, or in the case of a couple of women who used to basically swim naked, covered in grease, it's hard to have a kind of elitist prima donna thing going on when you're covered in grease, and the suffering was what the suffering was. Give us a preview, Marilyn. You and I have talked about the next nomination you're going to be working on. Give
Yeah.
us give us a preview of the swimmer who tried to break some barriers in the English Channel that might be up and coming.
So Willis Hanks is one of I became obsessed with these two swimmers. One was Pauline Jackson, who it took me years to track down her family, and the other was Willis Hanks. Also, I started years ago. These last names are not uncommon, they're very common. So Willis Hanks, if you try searching it took me so long. I was blindly this man caught my attention because he showed up as a swimmer in the teens as a pool swimmer, very fast pool swimmer, and he competed against whites. So there was New York City, a reporter named Paul Gallico in there was a New York newspaper, the Daily News, that had this really big swim classic in Central Park every year. And it was segregated, but they began inviting Black swimmers to compete, at least the records. And so Willis Hanks, he starts doing this. And then the more I learned about him, he got interested in swimming because he saw people who, a friend drown when he was young, but kids used to swim in the Harlem River. So he was in New York when Gertrude Ederle's parade happened, and he was so like inspired by what she did. So he was, a young teenager, but he was so inspired not only by her swim, because he was already sold on swimming, but the fact that she gained such attention and people were starting to say women should be equal to men. Women are equal to men. And of course, we know that that didn't really that didn't take off as much as people suspected at the day that things would change. But he saw that as an opportunity that he determined right there as a teenager, I want to swim the English Channel. I'm going to swim these distances. And he is just such a wonderful, compelling, just if you like Horatio Alger stories, rags to riches stories, he is just this person, he born and raised in Harlem, single mom, don't know who his dad was. He went to the YMCA and he began to swim there, and then he began to swim distances. He became a postman. He married his sweetheart. He started swimming distances in New York on his own and attracted attention. He became friends with Florence Chadwick when she swam the channel, and she encouraged him when she was in New York. She met with him and she said, I think you could do this. So she, again, it's a nice story of this supporting, crossing boundaries, encouraging him, introduced him to Sam Rocket. He starts training for the channel, raises money. He's friends with Jackie Robinson, Sugar Ray Robinson. They have these benefits to get money to send this New York postal worker to the English Channel. And he went in 1953, and then he couldn't make the attempt because of the weather. But there, he was there, and there's these, all of this is documented wonderfully. He's swimming with other people there. He develops friendships with Egyptian swimmers. He goes back the next year, far less money, because people are like, okay, we spent a lot of money to send this man last year. He didn't even get to do it. This is getting to be a hard sell. And at the same time, the civil rights movement is, becoming very prominent in the US. People are being a little bit more, I hate to say choosy, but in some ways, like there are more serious things happening than this one person doing the swim. So he does raise money to go. He does make the attempt. But at the same time as he makes the attempt, it's the same day as this, the Butland swim, they called it, and it was a race. He's not part of that. He makes the swim. It's not well documented. He fails. We do have photographs along the way of that, but he failed. And so because he failed, it sort of fizzles out. Again, other things, news is happening. Every swim that he made in New York, it just so happened that there was a tragedy that happened, and they were set to report on his swim, and then a building collapsed, and so nobody reports on his swim. So I feel very just drawn to this man who was such a good man, and who was his mission to teach children to swim, to teach especially Black children to swim, to promote marathon swimming. And he was kind of forgotten about because he didn't make it in something always prevented him from becoming big news, but he made many swims. So unlike Pauline Jackson, she was a pioneer, and she did swims, but she didn't complete, swims. He did complete swims. He may not have completed the English Channel swim, but he completed other swims. So it is my hope to start pestering you about and nominating him for recognition. A long list of swims that he won, but he's one of those people that just seems like the nicest person too, like just really good. When he has just had a baby, like he had 4 kids, they still call him daddy. They're just, the whole family is just a really amazing, wonderful family, and they're so proud of him. He died before I was born, but he just such a nice, I wish I had known him. He just seems like the nicest person, so, and a great swimmer. Um,
So Hank Willis, the first African-American to actually
Willis
get,
Willis Hanks. Yeah,
Willis
actually.
Hanks actually to
That's the
the
other
first,
reason is that people confuse his name all the time. So
so the first African-American swimmer to actually get to Dover, get wet,
yeah,
and have a go at it. Marilyn,
yeah,
you hinted that we might be able to do an interview in the future with his family. So that'd be something to
yeah,
look forward to.
yeah.
So I'll wrap up by thanking you, and I'll also say my standard piece, which is the Hall of Fame has more than 100 interviews of all kinds of subjects on marathon swimming in our YouTube library. In a second, the details will pop up. By all means, subscribe and look through the catalog. So thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ned. This was great. I love what you all do so much. And I'm glad that you're doing this, and anything that I can do to bring more attention to the history, the very, very rich history of the sport. It's an honor.
Thanks, Marilyn.